There she is. I think I told you guys I've been talking to Wayne, and he told me kind of a funny story. I guess he and Vala were out shopping there in that little town they live in, and they went to a pet store, and Vala just fell in love. There's this beautiful parrot, all colorful and everything, and Wayne said, no, he said, absolutely not. I'm not going to have a parrot in my house because, they learn bad words, they cuss, they're terrible animals, they're mean. I'm not going to have a parrot in it. And Vala just said, but look at it, it's so beautiful. And she noticed it had a little string tied to each leg. And so she asked the pet store, and she said, what are those strings on that parrot's legs? And he said, this parrot's one of a kind. It belonged to the old Baptist minister here in town. And he taught it for years to be just holy and righteous. And if you pull the string on its right leg, the parrot recites the Lord's Prayer. And he said, if you pull the string on the left leg, the parrot recites the 23rd Psalm. And you know Wayne, how he is. He goes, what happens if you pull both strings? And the parrot says, I fall off my purchase, you stupid Baptist. So, okay. I should have listened to you, dear. I should have told the other joke. All right, today we're going to primarily focus on what's called the Messianic miracles. So let me put this into kind of perspective here, big picture, and then we'll walk through it. It was expected that when Messiah showed up, there would be certain things only the Messiah could do. And because the Messiah was divine and was bringing the kingdom, there were certain miraculous signs that Messiah would do, and that was kind of, they would then know, the Pharisees, the scribes, the priests, the temple, they would know, this is the true Messiah. And that would be a validation. And, it's, some folks think there were three of these. I happen to fall into the I'm a 4 miracle guy as opposed to a 3 miracle guy. But these were validations. And so when we read the Gospels, if we look at Jesus's actions, we see that he did these miracles that were associated with Messiah. And we also then see the reaction of the scribes and the Pharisees in saying, no. There's a reason for that thing he did. He's not truly the Messiah. And it ultimately culminates in them attributing the work of Jesus to Satan, at which point Jesus then condemns that generation of Israel. But today we're going to look at these, and we're going to see how in the text we can start to see Jesus work one of these miracles. We can see from the response of the crowd and of the Pharisees and the scribes that they recognize this as one of these miracles, and they're having to deal with that and either discount it or follow along with it. So a little bit of background. For us today, we're all great 21st century folks, and we've seen the moon landing, and we understand science and everything, and for us, if you get, let's say you get a virus that came out of a lab somewhere in the world. I know that wouldn't happen, but let's just say you go to a doctor, and you don't sit at home and put leeches on, or you don't burn sage over your, well, I don't know, maybe you guys do, but you don't burn sage over your head and say incantation, right? Because we understand what bacteria is, we understand viruses, we get what doctors do, right? In the ancient world, and it doesn't mean they weren't as sophisticated as us, it just means they didn't have the information we have. I mean, if you think about it, understanding bacteria is a very recent thing. I mean, prior to that, nobody understood that there were these little bad bugs that could make you sick. But in Jesus's day, there was a tradition of healing that was widespread, both within Judaism, within the Greek and Roman cultures. Particularly at Jesus' time, the rabbis, the Pharisees, were folks that were viewed as, besides religious leaders, as healers. And they had established practice. I mean, you can look at these, you can find them in the writings of the time, and they were basic folk remedies like we find in a lot of cultures. There were, certain herbs or certain ingredients were put together. There might be a certain religious image or a writing from scripture that someone would wear, and so you had these sort of basic remedies that were used by the rabbis. And the rabbis taught that most things that happened were because you were bad, you had sinned. Not you guys, I know you guys don't sin, but let's say somebody, or that you had a demon somehow attacking or oppressing you. And I gave an example in the notes. This is from the Talmud, and the idea was that you don't want to drink water on the Sabbath, because if the water is still, there may be an evil spirit, and that would make you unclean for the Sabbath. So the rabbis had a cure for this, and I put that in the notes. It said if you do drink water on the Sabbath evening, if you say Psalm 39 verses 3 through 9, that'll drive any evil spirits away, because within those 6 verses, the phrase "the Lord shouts" is repeated 7 times, 7 being a biblical positive number. So this was the kind of thing that you would just, and everybody would do it. I left out the one, there's actually a really funny one. If you show up to the Sabbath meal and you have, how do I say this politely, dyspepsia, and you don't want to offend anyone there at the table with your little gassiness, there's actually a rabbinical cure for that. There's a little phrase that you say, and you repeat it. You say cough, 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 and a couple other things, and that takes care of the gas, so that you're not offending anyone at the Sabbath meal. So they have everything covered in this. Now, we know from the biblical text that the Pharisees were able to cast out demons at some level, right? We know Jesus says, you tell me I'm casting out by Satan. Well, who do you cast demons out by? Through the power of. So we know that some level, the rabbis could do some of the things that Jesus also did. They could do some basic healings. They could do some basic exorcisms. Jesus himself gave that power to the 12 when he told them, go out and cure people and cast out demons in my name. And we know that the apostles even came to him and said, wait a minute, Lord, there's somebody else over there casting out demons using your name. And Jesus basically said, that's okay. If you're not against me, you're with me. So we know that all this activity went on. So it wasn't like the only guy in town doing healings and exorcisms was Jesus. Okay, a lot of folks were doing this. Okay, so that's kind of the cultural background of what's going on. The biblical background, in Isaiah, there's a passage in Isaiah that talks about basically when Messiah comes, everyone will be healed. Everyone, there will be no illness, there will be no sickness or anything. And so the rabbis said, well, okay, when Messiah comes, we know that in the Messianic kingdom, no one will have illness or problems with demons or anything like that. And we know as rabbis, we can do a certain amount of the healing. So that slice of folks that can't be healed by a rabbi, but that are going to be in the Messianic kingdom, have to somehow get healed. Well, Messiah will do it. And that's the baseline that the rabbis set for the idea of Messiah being the one that can do certain healings. Again, so that in the kingdom, in the Messianic kingdom, there will be no illness, there'll be no possessions or anything like that. And so the oral tradition of the Jews, the Mishnah, began to teach this for hundreds of years. This began to be percolating through, and it finally got encased by the time Jesus's day. The oral law, the Mishnah, was pretty much set. We covered that when we talked about the Sermon on the Mount, how that was Jesus himself saying, you've heard it said, the Mishnah, the oral tradition. Well, what's written is the Bible, right? So we've seen that interaction already. And so what we start to see is the interaction between Jesus and this idea of the Messiah bringing healing and being able to drive out demons. So there's a discussion as to how many miracles there are. Okay, depending on who you read or what your source is, everybody agrees that curing a Jewish leper was one that Messiah could do, because the Jews couldn't cure a leper because you were immediately unclean. In the Bible, the only thing that we get in the law, in the Torah, about lepers is what to do once they're healed. There's nothing about how to heal, because you immediately become unclean. In fact, the idea was taught that leprosy was, the man was accounted as dead, walking dead. So that was one of them. Another one was healing a birth defect. And it's usually thought of a person who was born blind. If you went blind, you could see, and then you have an accident, you fall in the goat pen or something, and you get dirt in your eye, and suddenly you can't see. Well, that was, okay, we think we can treat that. The rabbis had various poultices and herbal remedies. But if a person was born as a baby, if they had a birth defect where they couldn't see, well, that was something a rabbi couldn't cure. Only God could go in there and actually recreate the physical part of the eye. So that was thought to be one of the miracles. The other one was driving out a particular type of demon. That was a demon from a person who was mute or deaf mute, or had some inability to communicate. Because the way the rabbis drove out demons is they had to know the demon's name. And so they had to interact with the person who was demon possessed. And if the person couldn't communicate, if they couldn't hear, if they couldn't speak, then the rabbis couldn't determine the demon's name, and they couldn't drive it out. So it was thought that only Messiah, who the Jewish tradition taught that Messiah, because of being divine, could read men's minds, know what is in man's heart, that they could do this. Those are the three basics. Now, a number of us believe that there's a fourth one, and that's bringing a person back from dead. Now, Jesus at his own resurrection proved that, but before that, Jesus brought back a guy from the dead. And it's very interesting, because when we look at that miracle, there are very specific parameters that it had to be after 4 days. Because prior to 4 days, the thought was, well, maybe the guy's just, in a medically induced coma, or something like that, right? So you had to be 4 days gone in order to have this viewed. So I view that as one of the Messianic miracles as well. So these are the miracles that are expected. So the first one I want to look at, and this one's critical because I believe this one Jesus does to start the process of saying, all right, you Pharisees and scribes, start investigating me because I'm the Messiah. And we're going to see textually where I think that stands. So the first one is the healing story of the healing a Jewish leper. And if you go to Luke, I'll go to Luke because I have a Bible. You can't come to church without your Bible, unless it's on your phone, and then that's okay. Sure. When I forget to bring my Bible to church, I just tell people, no, it's on my phone. And then I pull up Sudoku or something like that. But I say religious things when I play it. Okay, so healing of the leper. So it starts out in Luke, while Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came to him who was covered, page turn. Oh, this would be so much easier on my phone. Page with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he bowed down his face to the ground and begged him, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. So he stretched out his hand, Jesus did, touching him, saying, I am willing, be clean. So first off, Jesus touched a leper. Okay, that is a giant violation of the law, because Jesus has now become completely unclean in himself. This is one of the things the rabbis are going to argue against Jesus. He couldn't possibly be the Messiah because he's unclean. So anyway, so he heals the man. And then this is fascinating, because now here's where I think we start to see in the text this interaction with the Pharisees, and Jesus saying, okay, start the investigation now, start the clock running. He says, then he ordered the man, tell no one, but commanded him, go and show yourself to a priest and bring the offering for your cleansing as Moses commanded, as testimony to them. Jesus said, look it, I just did one of the big messianic miracles, but I don't want you to tell anybody. What I want you to go is go to the priest and say, hey, I'm a leper and a guy just healed me. Let's go through the process that the Torah says, that Moses said, that we have to do to prove I was healed and to prove that this was a miracle. So Jesus sends the guy off and says, all right, start the clock ticking. Messiah's here, folks. Here's the first guy, validate it. It's interesting what happens. The guy completely ignores Jesus, by the way, right? He says, but news about him spread even more, and large crowds were gathered together to hear him and to be healed of their illnesses. Yet Jesus frequently withdrew into the wilderness and prayed. So somehow word of this healing got out. The guy ended up going to I believe, to the temple to offer sacrifice, because the next thing we see is Jesus showing up, and suddenly there's all these Pharisees and experts in the law observing him. And if you don't make the connection between these two things, you have to say, well, why all of a sudden are all these guys showing up? If we read in Luke 5:17, now on one of those days, while he was teaching there, the Pharisees and teachers of the law sitting nearby, who had come from every village of Galilee and Judea and even Jerusalem. Well, why all the top brass suddenly shows up for this backwater, Jewish teacher healer guy? I mean, Pharisees and scribes from Jerusalem are showing up. Well, it's because they're investigating the fact that Jesus had worked that miracle, which was a messianic miracle, and sent the man to the priests and scribes, to the temple, to say, okay, here's your, validate it, I'm here, I'm Messiah. Now, the oral law says that the way this process worked is that the miraculous guy would come, and they would, one, validate, yes, okay, clearly you were a leper, now you're not a leper, and we're going to offer all our sacrifices the way we're supposed to do. And then we're going to start investigating. And what they would do is they wouldn't interact with the guy claiming to be Messiah. They would just sit and observe. Okay, let's see what else is he going to do another miracle? Is this just a one-off? Is he acting on behalf of Satan? What's he doing? So that's why we see suddenly all the Pharisees and all the teachers in the law showing up to observe Jesus as he starts teaching and going around town. You see how this is tying together? Okay. Next thing, and again, because this class is only 7 weeks long, I have to kind of jump. So you'll pardon me if I skip over a big part of the New Testament right now and jump to the next miracle, which is the man born blind. This one, we really start to see the interaction with the religious leaders. So, excuse me, if you go to John 9, again, and I know I've said this over and over and you're sick of it, but what the heck, you paid to get in here today, so I'll say it again. The purpose of John's gospel is to prove that Jesus is the Christ. And that word Christ means anointed one, which is the Greek word which means Messiah, which means anointed one. The purpose of John's gospel, John tells us, is to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. Okay? And John chose certain stories to include in his gospel to show us that Jesus was Messiah. And one of those stories is the healing of the man born blind, which was one of the 3, or 4 Messianic miracles. Okay? So, John 9. Jesus now was passing by. He saw a man who'd been blind from birth. This is critical. He was blind from birth. He hadn't lost his sight in a farming accident. He hadn't got accidentally poked in his eye by a stick when he was playing swords with his buddies when he was 5. He was born blind. That kicks this up to the level of Messianic miracle. There was also an assumption in the culture that if you had a birth defect, that was your fault, or maybe it was your parents' fault, because the thought was that illness and birth defects and things that we now understand from a medical standpoint, in the culture then it was thought that you either caused it, you were possessed, or God was punishing you somehow. So here this poor guy's born blind from birth, but the thought was, well, he must have done something wrong in his past. He must have sinned. His parents might have sinned, and he's bearing the guilt for it. I put a little quote in the notes from the Talmud. The Talmud taught that if a woman was pregnant and she happened to go to a pagan temple and worship at a pagan temple, a Jewish woman, she was guilty of idolatry, but so was the little baby inside her. That even though the baby got taken there in mom's belly, that the baby was guilty of idolatry because it was in the temple, a pagan temple as well. So the rabbis would tell you both the mother and the unborn baby were both guilty of idolatry. So when that kid got born, if something happened to be, oh, well, that's sin of idolatry right there. So the Talmud taught that you could inherit sin from before your birth, which would explain occasionally my son and daughter when they were growing up, but that's a whole nother story. So now you look at Jesus basically debunks this in verse 4. He talks about how he is the light of the world, and that this isn't an issue with a man's sin, but it has to do with Jesus working this miracle as Messiah. So the first thing he does is he heals the guy, okay? And it's kind of interesting. He says, having said this, Jesus spat on the ground and made some mud with the saliva, and he smeared it on the blind man's eyes, and so said, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So it's pretty icky if you ask me. I mean, even guys that I really get along well, you know, if Dan Deaton, who is a good friend of mine, spit on the ground and took that mud and smeared it on me, I would be really grossed out. And Dan's a clean guy, but I would still be really grossed out. Well, okay. So you're like, why is Jesus spitting and making mud to heal this guy's eyes? Again, when we understand the cultural setting, it just jumps out at us. There are two possible reasons why Jesus did that. The first was the Mishnah, the oral law, forbid anyone on the Sabbath to heal an eye problem using either wine or mud. It turns out this healing was on the Sabbath. So the Mishnah specifically said, if you want to heal a guy's eyes, you can't dribble wine in there, or you can't put mud on the eyes on the Sabbath, because that's a violation of the Sabbath law. So what does Jesus do? He puts mud in the guy's eyes. Here's mud in your eye, right? So culturally, we look at this, we go, wow, again, Jesus is interacting with this oral tradition of telling people how to live their life according to the law. And Jesus breaks the tradition by doing this. The other possibility is there was a belief at the time that the firstborn child had somewhat magical powers. So any of you here that are firstborn, particularly if you're firstborn male, you got some mojo going for you, okay? And it was thought that the firstborn male's saliva could actually be healing. So, your older brother could spit on you if you had a fever. And at the time they would think, so that probably grosses you out if you have an older brother go, you're not spitting on me, dude. But that was the other possible belief. I personally think that it was Jesus directly interacting with the Mishnah. And the Mishnah says you can't use mud to heal a guy's eye problem on the Sabbath. And Jesus goes, really? Watch me. Bam. Okay? So now what's interesting, and I always tell people, when you're going through the scriptures, you need to not only see what the action that took place, but you need to look in the text to see the reaction of the people that have seen it, right? You need to see the reaction of the people. When Jesus claimed to be God and he used the sacred name of God, what did they do? They picked up stones and tried to kill him because that was blasphemy. And we can tell that Jesus used the actual name of God because of the reaction of the crowd. They tried to kill him, which is what they would do if he used the name of God. So you understand a lot of times by seeing the reaction of the crowd. So what's the reaction of the man? Well, he goes to the pool of Siloam to wash his eyes to heal. Now, this is interesting because, again, here is a culturally Jewish thing from Jesus's day that we lose because we don't understand that. But the pool of Siloam was where, during the Feast of Tabernacles, during Sukkot, the water from the pool of Siloam was brought to the temple and poured on the altar. That's where they got the water to pour on the altar, was the pool of Siloam. The Feast of Sukkot, which we'll talk about in 2 weeks, the Feast of Tabernacles was the final Jewish feast of the year, and it was the one that they assumed when Messiah came, he would come at the Feast of Tabernacles. He would come on Sukkot. And so over and over, we're going to see how that feast plays in pointing to Jesus as Messiah. But what's fascinating is that Jesus, instead of just saying, go wipe your eyes with a rag, go over here, he specifically sends him to the pool of Siloam, which is tied to temple practice, tied to the Feast of Sukkot, which is tied to the return of Messiah. So we start to see these little cultural details. Now, the next thing, and here's where we see the reaction of the crowd, the neighbors and the family. So this guy's born blind, right? From the time he's came out of mom, he could not see. All of a sudden he can see. Verse 8, then the neighbors and the people who had seen him previously as a beggar began saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? And some people said, yeah, this is the man. And others said, nah, it just looks like him. Well, nah, it's not in the Bible. That's my translation of the Greek. And the man himself kept saying, no, it's me. And so they asked him, how were you made to see? And he replied, well, the man called Jesus made mud and smeared it on my eyes. Then he told me to go to Siloam and wash, and I went and washed, and now I can see. And everybody went, wow, where is this man? Where is Jesus? This is a big deal. So you see the reaction of this poor man's family and friends at first going, nah, that didn't happen. Come on, you've been blind your whole life. To suddenly going, wait a minute, we got to go find the guy that healed you. So we understand that at the point of the activity, it was viewed as this miraculous thing. Okay, so now we jump ahead. Verse 13. So they bring the guy to the Pharisees. Now, John then adds in, now the day on which Jesus made the mud and caused him to see was the Sabbath. So that's the proof for my position that Jesus violated Sabbath law by using mud, okay? So the Pharisee, verse 15, so the Pharisees asked him again, how had he gained his sight? And the man replied, he put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and now I can see. Wow, that'd be a great hymn. Now I was blind, now I can see. Somebody write a song about that. Verse 16, and some of the Pharisees began to say, this man is not from God, because he doesn't observe the Sabbath. You see, to them, the miracle wasn't important. The man was healed. What was important was the laws. We have to keep, and not just the Torah, we have to keep the Mishnah, which says no mud eye healing on the Sabbath. So this guy couldn't possibly have worked a miracle. But others said, how can a man who's a sinner perform such miraculous signs? In other words, wait a minute. Okay, half of you guys are saying he's a sinner because he violated the Mishnah, but how could he work a messianic miracle if he's a sinner? And I love this. So there was a division amongst them. Imagine that, Pharisees fighting with each other over a point in the law. By the way, that does not happen amongst Christian theologians. Amongst Christians, there you will never find disagreement or divisions. No, never. Certainly not at this church. So again, they asked the man who was blind, what do you say about him since he caused you to see? And the man said, well, he's a prophet, right? So that's a big deal. He didn't say he was Messiah, but he said he was a prophet. And the religious leaders, verse 18, refused to believe that he'd really been blind, and they thought he'd gained his sight some other way, and they summoned the man's parents to come see. So they can't get the answers they want out of the guy who actually received the miracle. So now they're going to call the parents in. This is the next level of investigation of Jesus as Messiah. The first was when he cured the leper, and they all came into this backwater little area from Jerusalem, from Judea, from Galilee, to observe Jesus. Now they've got the guy who was healed, and they're questioning him. They're not questioning Jesus yet. They're questioning this guy. And then when they don't get the answers, now they start to question the family. So, okay. Verse 18. Now the Jewish leaders refused to believe that he'd really been born blind. See, they're going to prove this. They're going to talk to the parents. The parents will say, oh, yeah, he got kicked by a goat when he was 7 or something, right? And they asked the parents, is this your son whom you say was born blind? Then how does he now see? The parents replied, we're in verse 20, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how he is now able to see, nor do we know who caused him to see. I mean, ask him. He's a mature adult. You see, the parents, one, confirmed that it was a birth defect. But number two, the parents are like, can you leave us out of this, please? Why don't you go, he's a grown-up, go talk to him. The reason why all this takes place is, and we'll see this in verse 22 when we get to it, they were afraid of the Pharisees. Because what the Pharisees could do, what the rabbis had the power to do, was they could ostracize you from society. They could ban you from going to synagogue. They could ban you from doing business with the folks in your area. They could essentially make you poverty-driven outside of town. The Pharisees had that power. If you crossed them, they could basically throw you out of society. The parents here, I believe, are good folks. They're like, look it, don't pull us into this. Talk to my kid. He's the one that had the miracle. But we'll tell you, he was born blind, and now he can see. So the parents aren't wanting to get thrown out of the synagogue at this point. Verse 22, his parents said these things because they were afraid of the Jewish religious leaders, for the Jewish leaders had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah, Jesus is the Christ, would be put out of the synagogue. See, they were afraid that if they said the truth, Jesus, this guy over here, worked the messianic miracle, that the Pharisees would react by throwing them out of the synagogue. They wouldn't be able to do business. They would be ostracized by their friends. They would essentially lose their life as they knew it. For this reason, the parents said he's a mature adult, go ask him. So they call the guy in a second time. Okay, so they talk to him once. They get the full story. They grill the parents. They get the parents' story. Now they call the poor blind guy back in one more time. And they say, they summoned the man who used to be blind a second time and said to him, promise before God to tell the truth. We know that this man is a sinner, right? So they're dredging up the whole breaking the Sabbath thing. They're telling this man, and this, we might say, hand on the Bible, sure, I'll tell the truth. But in this, he's promising to be struck dead by a lightning bolt if he lies. That's basically what's going on. So he says, look, I don't know whether he was a sinner. I do know one thing, that although I was blind, I can now see. Then they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he make you see? And the guy answered back, I told you already, and you didn't listen. I love that. He's just sniping me. I told you, and you didn't listen to me. He said, what do you want to hear again? You people don't want to become his disciples, do you? The sarcasm is just amazing there, right? Why do you want the story again? Do you want to believe he's Messiah too? You just see the rabbis have got to just be steaming at this point, right? And so what do? Verse 28, they heaped insults on him, saying, you are his disciple. We are the disciples of Moses. There we go. We do not know where this man comes from. And the man replied, this is a remarkable thing that you don't know where he comes from, and yet he caused me to see. Rabbis, we know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is devout and does his will, God listens to him. Never before has anyone heard of someone causing a man born blind to see. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And the Pharisees replied back, you were born completely in sin, and yet you presume to teach us? So they throw him out. So it's basically, they don't have an answer to the argument. They just say, we don't like you, get out of here. Right? And the guy is clearly saying, how could he do a messianic miracle if he wasn't from God? So Jesus hears that that they threw him out and that they didn't agree. And verse 35, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. So he found the man and said to him, do you believe in the Son of Man? The Son of Man, by the way, is a technical phrase for Messiah. Do you believe in the Son of the Man? The man replied, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said, you've seen him. He's the one speaking to you. And the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. Jesus turned the page and said, I've come into this world, those who do not see may gain their sight, and the ones who see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this and asked him, we are not blind too, are we? And Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but you claim that you see, so your guilt remains. So the ending of this particular miracle, Jesus goes to the man and says, I'm the guy that healed you. I'm him. And the guy said, you are the Christ, and he worships him. He recognized him as Messiah. The Pharisees, who were steeped in the law, who said they were from Moses, they don't. And Jesus even said, look, if you guys were blind, then you might be off the hook, but you know the deal, and you're still against it. So here we have the first miracle is the healed leper, where he's sent off and they're observing Jesus. The next big miracle, Jesus comes along and they really grill everybody involved in the story. And everybody involved in the story, the man who was healed, worships Jesus as Messiah. He gets it. The Pharisees continue to harden their hearts. There's going to be another miracle we're going to talk about next week that I'm skipping over because it's critical in the timeline of Jesus' ministry. But the last miracle we're going to look today is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Again, there was this idea that when you die, your soul sort of just hangs around the area. It's not ready to quite leave, kind of like the body it was in. It kind of hangs around. And it's watching you, thinking, well, maybe I could get back in there. Maybe I'll come back. Let me see what I could do. So it's kind of floating around the body, waiting. And after about 3 days, you're out in the desert. It's kind of nasty out there, and got a dead body, and it starts to get a little ugly, a little smelly, and the spirit's floating above it going, whoa, man, that thing's getting ugly and stinky. I'm not going back in there. And so the spirit takes off, hangs out Abraham's bosom. So now you're just left with a dead, decomposing, stinky body. But it takes 4 days. Prior to that 4 days, prior to the end of that third day, there's a possibility the old spirit could pop back into the body and somebody'd say, oh, he was just taking a long nap. He wasn't really dead. After 4 days, they believed. Now, you're, as they say in The Wizard of Oz, sincerely dead. Okay? So, this will be the only Sunday school class on campus today quoting from The Wizard of Oz, by the way. I just want to let you know. That's what you get when you come in here. So, Jesus is made aware that his friend Lazarus is really sick. And so much to the point that he goes, yeah, okay, I'm not going to do anything about it. And they go, but if you don't get there quick, the guy may die. And she's like, no, I'm not going to go yet. And when you understand this 4-day thing, you start to see, oh, I get it. He's intentionally waiting so he can work this miracle. Oh, I get it now. And so Jesus finally shows up after the 4 days. This made it a miracle that only the Messiah could do. So Jesus has an interaction with Martha and Mary. And this is one of the great passages in Scripture, by the way, where I think it just shores up the idea that we are saved by faith through grace and not of works. Because Jesus is talking to Martha and Mary, and he talks to Martha and he says, he kind of smoothed things over because she's like, how come you let my brother die? You could have blah, blah, blah. And he's like, it's okay. I did it for a reason, And he ends up asking her the question, do you believe that I'm the resurrection and the life? And her response is wonderful. It says, yeah, I do. And he says, well, basically your faith has saved you. It was the simple trusting in him as Messiah that she said he didn't say, now go, put a fish bumper sticker on the back of your ox cart, or, now you can only listen to temple songs, or, you have to go do some religious ceremony. She just said, yes, I believe. And it's a wonderful story, even though it's still under the law, it's not church age, but it's still a wonderful story that you read in the gospel over and over. What do people do? They believe that Jesus is Messiah. And there's never anything else added to that, unless you're a Pharisee. So Jesus comes out and he resurrects Lazarus from the dead. Now, I've always said that Lazarus is probably the most unlucky guy in the entire history of the world. Because, in my life, and I'm sure for most of you, you say, well, okay, this is going to be really terrible, this thing I have to go through, but at least it's not going to kill me, right? Because the worst thing that can happen is I get killed. Right? I mean, that's like the worst thing could happen, right? Oh man, I get killed. What happens to Lazarus? He dies, and then he's brought back. He has to die a second time. Okay, Jesus was brought back and he's not dying anymore. Poor Lazarus has got to go through it a second time. I'm only hoping, it's not recorded in Scripture, but that the grace of God allows Lazarus to live a long, happy life, and that he passes peacefully in his sleep with a smile on his face or something, that he doesn't have to fall off a rock or something, just because it's got to be terrible to have to die. You get brought back and you go, crap, now I gotta die again. Thanks a lot, Jesus. So he's brought back. Jesus brings him out of the tomb, and what I love is that this image of him is, they roll the stone away from the tomb, and everybody's going, whoa, okay, that's a dead body in there, right? And then Jesus says, come out. And then it says they have to unwrap him. So he kind of, you can just see him hopping. Here I am, here's this stinky old body wrapped up in cloth hopping out of the tomb, and he comes back to life. So Jesus is now, he's reanimated a dead human body. His miracle before this was to physically recreate the eyes of a man that were defective through his miraculous power. Now he brings a guy back from the dead. If we go to John 11, and okay, let me get to this. verse 45, now that Jewish leaders respond to this, then many of the people who had come with Mary had seen the things Jesus did, believed in him. So there are a lot of folks that got that Jesus was Messiah. We refer to them as the faithful remnant or any of the good things. But some of them went to the Pharisees and reported to them what Jesus had done. Verse 47, so the chief priests and the Pharisees called the council together and said, what are we doing? For this man is performing many miraculous signs. In other words, wait a minute, this guy has just knocked off 3 of the big miracles. What are we going to do about it? Verse 48, if we allow him to go on this way, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away our sanctuary and our nation. Then one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said, you know nothing at all. You do not realize that it's more to your advantage to have this one man die for the people rather than that the whole nation to perish. I think Spock said something similar in Star Trek at some point. Look at that. We quoted Wizard of Oz and Star Trek. This is such a great class. Okay, so verse 51, now he did not say this on his own, but because he was high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the Jewish nation and die for the Jewish nation, not for the Jewish nation only, but to gather together into one all the children of God who were scattered. So from that day, they planned together to kill him. So instead of saying, you know what, this guy has just proven that he's Messiah, instead they say, no, we got to get rid of this guy. And why do they have to get rid of him? They have to get rid of him because he is gonna cause them to lose political power and security. They're afraid that if suddenly the Messiah shows up, that the kingdom of the Messiah will be in process, and they don't have enough faith to say, let Messiah take care of Rome. They say, no. If Rome hears about this guy, man, it's gonna be all over for us. We are gonna lose our power. They're going to come down here and probably lock the temple. No. We got to get rid of this guy. We got to kill him to retain their political power. The funny thing about this is by rejecting Messiah, they will end up losing everything that they said they were afraid they were going to lose. Rome will eventually come in to destroy Jerusalem and destroy the temple, and all these rabbis are going to run like rats on a sinking ship. Right? So the thing they fear the most, they decide to kill Jesus over, is going to happen to them anyway because it's God's condemnation of them refusing to believe Jesus is Messiah. So these are the Messianic miracles. I know that Jesus works all kinds of miracles and healings and stuff in the Bible, but these are the critical ones. And it allows us within the text to see how Jesus worked the miracles that were expected by Messiah, and how the people believed him, and the religious leaders progressively studied him, watched him, and then rejected him. Next week, we're going to look at the ultimate rejection, where they claim that he's doing all of this in the name of Satan. But this week, it's an example of how Jesus worked the miracles expected of Messiah, people believed, religious leaders condemned him for it. Questions? Oh, all kinds of hands. Okay, I will start. Let me start in the back and work forward. Marianne.
I just wondered if after the Holy Spirit came Pentecost, were any of these 4 repeated after that, after Christ rose by the disciples?
The question is, were any of the Messianic miracles repeated by the disciples after Pentecost in the church age? There were many miracles in the church age attributed to the work of the Holy Spirit and to God, but the Messianic miracles were no longer necessary because we are now in the church age, no longer under the law. The Messianic miracles were tied to the law. Okay, next question. Yes?
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I had read a book about the neurology of seeing stuff, and it was shown in the book that if you have not had sight when you were young, actually, if you could get sight later, you wouldn't know what you're looking at. So it was like even more of a miracle than just opening his eyes, because know what it is you're seeing.
Right. The question or the statement was that the neurology behind sight creates certain synapses in your brain that we all take for granted because we've been able to see since we popped out in the delivery room. But a person who was born blind, who physically had their eyesight recreated as an adult, would not have those synaptic patterns or connections. And so in order to be able to see and function, that had to be restored as well. So I think that this particular miracle has always been one of my favorites because it's so big what Jesus had to do. He had to recreate the eye. He had to recreate the synaptic relationships within the brain and the neurologist. So yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you. Denny.
In Luke 5:17, I had my initial impression of that was they had come to evaluate to see if Jesus was when all the people came all the time. They came to evaluate if he was the Messiah. But the commentators don't even go there. They just say no. They can't find things to condemn him for.
Yeah, the question is many commentators take Luke 5:17 to say the reason why all the Pharisees showed up was to simply find grounds to condemn Jesus. We don't find this kind of level of need for condemnation that early within Jesus's ministry. We find it really taking place from the blind healing forward. I think you have a hard time explaining why you had people from Jerusalem and all of Judea and whatnot. I mean, really the big time Pharisees and scribes coming to hear him teach if all they wanted to do was condemn him. I think there had to be some catalyst. I also believe that Luke intentionally, in writing that gospel, put those two things just cheek to jowl in there, that he has this miracle, go to the temple and show them that this miracle has occurred. And in the very next section, he has all of these folks from all over suddenly observing Jesus. I just think that that fits the arc of the story much closer to assume they were evaluating him as Messiah than if they just happen to show up to say, we got to get rid of this guy. So that's my take on it. And I'm assuming that's yours as well. Some of the commentators will go after Jesus ignoring the messianic aspect of his ministry and just look at him as like a supercharged rabbi, and that I think goes outside of what the gospel authors were trying to do. Questions? Yeah.
You said that Jesus said, "Come forth." Lazarus came forth, but actually he said, "Lazarus, come forth." Because if he had said, "Come forth," you'd have dozens and dozens and dozens of bodies come out, hopping in their birth clothes and their birth clothes and their wrappings.
That's an interesting point. I didn't think of that. The point is that Jesus, instead of just saying "come forth," he specifically said Lazarus, because if he hadn't, you would have had wrapped up dead bodies just jumping around like crazy, like crickets coming out from under a rock. Yeah, that would be quite startling. The Lazarus thing would have freaked me out, by the way, had I been there. But you're right, having 5 or 6 guys all hopping out, which one's Lazarus? The rest of you get back in there. You're not done yet. Okay, question back here. Yes, you, Becky.
Matthew, it says that when Jesus sent the disciples out, that they also cleansed lepers and raised the dead. So is it because of the authority they had from Jesus, the Messiah, to do those things, that they would be able to do those same kinds of miracles? Or because they did those too?
The question is, when the disciples were sent out by Jesus, they also performed miracles that were similar to Messiah. And yes, they were acting under the power and authority of Messiah to do that. It wasn't that they already possessed that power, or that it was somehow in the culture outside of the Messiah. So yes, they went out under the authority and power of Messiah as his chosen 12, and carried on his authority and power in what they did.
It wasn't just Jesus directly who cleansed lepers and raised the dead, but the disciples did too.
Right, and we know that part of that, and I don't know if I specifically said this or not. I'm sorry, I apologize. I, I thought I'd said it earlier, but Jesus came initially to offer the Messianic kingdom to Israel. And part of the kingdom was to show, look at all this wonderful stuff. There are going to be healings and miracles, and people will be cleansed. And so part of bringing the kingdom to Israel, I think, was taking the 12 and saying, go out and spread the kingdom, go out and heal people and show folks Messiah's here. Life is really going to be good. So often as Christians, we read these texts and say, oh yeah, he was bringing the kingdom of God. He was basically bringing the church, or he was bringing nice stuff to Israel. No, he was bringing the actual Messianic kingdom. And I think that's what we see in the action of the 12. And we do know that other people were driving out demons in his name, and he was okay with that. You know, he told the disciples, don't get all upset. They're doing the work too. Jeanette, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wondered about Elijah. You know, when he raised either him or Elisha, but when he raised the widow's son, what was the difference? Like, how did the Pharisees view that one? And was there ever a question about Elijah being the Messiah?
Well, I think that it was well known very soon after Elijah that he was tied to Messiah as the one who would announce Messiah's coming. And we're going to see that when we talk about the transfiguration. Elijah becomes part of it. We saw a little bit of that in discussing John the Baptist's role as possibly being, was he Elijah or not? As far as him healing, him bringing the person back to life, was that a messianic miracle? I don't think that was at a point where it was viewed that. He was viewed as a very powerful prophet, but I don't think he was viewed in the role as Messiah, because we start to see that there was a development of the understanding of Messiah initially as coming back solely as the leader of Israel and God's chosen son. And then we start to see in the later prophets, we start to see later on, that they start to see two types of Messiah. There's a Messiah of Joseph, a Messiah of David. One will be the political ruler king. The other will be the warrior who will be conquering the enemies. And I think that they hadn't, prior to Jesus's day, I don't think that had fully become as involved in the understanding of Messiah. So I think Elijah, and this is my opinion, please, this is solely my opinion here. I think that Elijah is viewed as doing a work of a great prophet, but they weren't putting that in the same category as Messiah. That's my take on it. Yeah.
Would after 4 days factor come into there too?
Well, it could be. I mean, that was a cultural view, and not just with the Jews, by the way. Many of these things that we attribute to Jewish were just part of Semitic culture in general. I mean, even today, you know, if you're a Muslim and you die, you got to get them in the ground. I mean, you can't wait. You know, my mom died. It took like, I don't know, a week and a half to get the funeral over with. Had, you know, if we were Muslim, mom would have been in the ground over at Westminster in 24 hours. So this idea of a length of time that the body needs to be interred and the role of the spirit, I think, was common in a lot of Semitic cultures. So yeah, I think it was probably around during Elijah's time, but that wasn't mentioned specifically in the text in the way that it is in the Johannine text. So I don't know if that answers your question, but you know, it could be, but we're interacting with here. It's very specifically brought up in the text to point to Jesus.
You're saying that to have a messianic resurrection, the person had to be dead for 4 days.
Right. Yeah, because after that, you know, it wasn't an accident. The guy wasn't in a coma, and a rabbi couldn't show up and sprinkle him with herbs. That 4 days, in their view, actually in all Semitic culture, 4 days is 4 days, man. You were toast at that point. You weren't coming back. So, yeah.
A couple of years ago, I had a kid in Awana. The parents weren't from this church, and they had a real problem with the timeline. was Christ like in the grave like 3 full days, as defined by Jewish days? For that to be a messianic resurrection?
Okay, the question is, how do we talk about the 3 days, 4-day thing? How long was Christ in the grave? And the timeline that we find in the Gospels. Quick answer is, I don't have enough time to go through that now because you guys will be here for another 2 hours. And quite frankly, the Raiders are coming on in about an hour, so you got to get home and see football. But the slightly longer answer is, we find in the gospel 2 different ways of describing the time frame. Jesus was using the phrase 3 days and 3 nights. We get a strong reference to that because he referenced Jonah and the whale when he was telling the Jews that you won't get a sign other than the sign of Jonah. And just like Jonah, I will be in the earth 3 days and 3 nights. I think that that's a valid time frame for understanding, but I think it's different than the understanding here that you had a sincerely dead person who Jesus brought back, as opposed to Jesus's glorious resurrection, which was the final thing to show he was Messiah. Didn't need that 4-day lock-in. That's kind of a slightly longer answer. I would tell you an excellent treatment of this is in the book by Harold Hoehner called Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ. I've recommended that book numerous times. It is a small book, but it is mighty. It's just the best. And it talks about the timeline of the time in the tomb. It does the best description of Daniel's 70 weeks that I've ever read. It is available print on demand, I believe, through Amazon. Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ by Harold Hoehner. Hoehner is spelled Hoener, I believe. Also, if you ever want to read the definitive commentary on Ephesians, Harold Hoehner's commentary on Ephesians, but it's a very academic commentary. So if you're having trouble sleeping. Any other questions? Okay, I have to be done because, well, the pastor just showed up, so I don't want to be, Yeah.
Real quick one. I noticed in the leper, and he touched the leper, and then also remember the woman that had bleeding for
Right.
12 years. It says immediately he was healed, immediately healed, and I always attribute that to Jesus being impure. It was like he touched him, but he was healed, so it's like he wasn't unclean. Your thoughts on that?
Well, no, I think that's true. I think if we're looking at the healings of Jesus throughout, it's clear there was divine power being physically communicated to that body he was interacting with. What I find interesting is that he was even able to heal a person who just simply touched his garment. Specifically in the healing of the leper, he had to touch him because that's being viewed in this context of the Messianic miracle. So there had to be physical touch. Physically touching the blind man by putting the mud, again, was Jesus sort of saying, I'm not doing what the Mishnah says, the oral law says this, I'm going to show you what it is. So he physically had to touch him there. But yes, I do believe in general the miracles show that he had divine power. He could flow through him. Not Ernest Angley level where he could heal through a TV, but, pretty close. Yeah.
The centurion servant healing would be.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, centurion's servant is another example. So yeah, Jesus was a powerful dude, man. He could, and again, dude is a Greek phrase that, yeah. Okay, I will see everybody next week. God willing, the creek don't rise. No applesauce. Put the sign up, Johnny.
When you made that comment about the Greek phrase, I watched My Big Fat Greek